Good morning, everybody. This is Don Lifto. I'm a director with Baker Tilly, working in the public education group. Prior to my work at Baker Tilly, I was a public school superintendent for 25 years. Currently, the vast majority of my work at Baker Tilly is helping school districts plan and conduct school referenda. And that's the topic of today's MASA master class. Thanks to MASA for the opportunity to share this information with you. Before I get into the content, just some quick logistics. We will be taking a short break somewhere around halfway through. So if you need to make a quick call or use the restroom or stretch your legs, there will be that opportunity this morning. The Q&A I'm going to do at the end. I know some of you use the chat feature, but assuming we stay on schedule, there will be ample time to answer your questions. So jot them down as you're thinking of them, and I'll field those at the end. And just double check to make sure that you're on mute and your video is turned off until we get to the Q&A. Thanks for all of that, and let's go ahead and get started. When we're talking about getting out the vote, which is one of the most important parts of a good referendum campaign for a school district, it's always good to start with kind of a framework, paying attention to school board policies, laws, and your own good judgment. Questions come up during the course of a campaign, including when you're actually working on GOTV efforts at the end. Things like, can we use the school mailboxes for the Vote Yes committee? Can we use our auto dialer to remind parents to vote? Can the Vote Yes committee have a table at the football game? And there's a long list of questions that come up. And for some of those questions, you can handle those at the front end. And either looking at your school board policies or touching base with your lawyer so you don't on an issue you could have avoided if you'd paid attention to your policies and legal guidelines. So how important is GOTV within the context of a broad campaign? Paul Wellstone's grassroots politics is one example. When he was alive and campaigning in Minnesota, you were not permitted to volunteer for the campaign unless you did three things. One, volunteer at least one day a week, write a check to the campaign, and take election day off to help with GOTV. His last campaign that he ran, 5,000 people pounded election day as an example. That emphasis on GOTV. So the research tells us that GOTV is extremely important. Unfortunately, sometimes campaigns kind of run out of gas and kind of limp to the finish line, which can have some pretty devastating effects. Here are some examples of a profile of a district that did not do a good job with GOTV. This is a real district and a real election. Over on the left, you can see that there was support for the referendum among 18 to 44-year-olds at almost 71%, which is excellent. But the blue bar is how many people showed up and voted on election day. Unfortunately, this is a pretty common profile, particularly in elections that aren't tied to a big turnout like we had in November of 2020. When you've got 71% support from a demographic group and only 11% get in the door, it's very unlikely you're going to have a happy election outcome. Here's another example that kind of emphasizes the power of contact. And I'm just going to highlight 3 of the columns that you're looking at to help you draw meaning to them. In column 1, what you're seeing is that 2/3 of people who were not contacted by anybody, nobody knocked on the door, nobody sent them an email, nobody called them, about 2/3 of them didn't vote who were not contacted. In column 2, which is quite a reversal of column 1, 61% of the people who were contacted cast a vote. And if you jump over to column 5 are people that the campaign assumed were yes voters. They might have been parents, they might have been employees of the district, they might have been people in the PTA. So of the people that the campaign just assumed were going to vote yes, they were not contacted by anybody. And 60% of them did not vote. So GOTV contact is extremely important. Some districts will go to rather extreme measures. What day am I supposed to vote? To vote for the king, it's November 4. I'm voting for his opponent. Well, that's November 5. With what we just experienced in our most recent election, some of these old cartoons bring new meaning to our perspective about elections. As I said, some districts will go to any length to try to get people to vote. So how do we go about executing a successful GOTV plan? If you're not going to cheat and you're not going to use your dogs to promote elections, you need a second option, and that's using research and best practices. You need to figure out how many people are going to vote, figure out how many yes voters you need to win, canvass. Now, canvass is calling people and door knocking, but not GOTV. Canvassing is done a month or 2 before the people vote. Plan and execute your GOTV strategies, mobilizing your yes voters, and demobilize likely no voters into non-voters. You see that the term cognitive dissonance mentioned there. Cognitive dissonance is when you put an idea or an experience in someone's head that causes them to question their motives to vote no. Give you a couple examples. Older men are not famous for casting yes votes for tax increases, but if a district got dads and grandpas involved once a week in reading to kids in the elementary schools, that could make them kind of pause. That's not necessarily going to turn them into a progressive and want to raise their taxes, but it might give them enough of a pause to stay home and not vote at all. Another example, when I was a superintendent in this particular district, for whatever reason, the Legion and the Lion clubs, which were all men at the times, were kind of crabby. I thought of them as a bunch of crabby old guys. And they didn't like taxes, and they had kind of a chip on their shoulder. And what we did in their example was we got them involved in coming into our schools every year and going into the classrooms on Flag Day, handing out little flags and talking about the history of the flag. Over time, that turned some of them into supporters, but it also turned some of them into non-voters. So if we're going to be starting our plan with estimating the turnout in a particular election, we need to understand how turnout in Minnesota has typically been over time. So at the top, you can see the presidential type election, usually in the 60 to 75% turnout range. In November of 2020, Minnesota led the nation at 79.95% turnout. In the middle turnout scenario, that would be an even year non-presidential. So that would be 2022, for example, or 2018. And then in what oftentimes are referred to as diminished ballot elections, that's when you are the only thing on the ballot. Maybe it's a February or an August or November 2021 when there's nothing on the ballot other than you, and those typically range in the 25 to 40%. Estimating turnout is a combination of science plus art. Science relates to getting into a database and looking at turnout percentages that occurred in your school district in past elections that were similar. Here's an example of why that's so important using the New Prague area school district. What you're seeing there is the results of 7 operating referenda between 1995 and 2011. As you can see, they passed some of them and failed some of them. But what was interesting when we look at those numbers is the turnout in those elections, in those 7 operating referenda, ranged from 2,736 to 5,014 voters. And even more interesting, they won one of these with only 1,569 yes voters. And they lost one with 600 more yes voters at 2,196. So timing definitely is important, and timing matters. So we need to look at turnout over time, and particularly look apples to apples. We don't want to compare make turnout assumptions about November of 2021 based on the turnout in November of 2020, for example. We also have art, the art of predicting turnout. And the art can be lots of different things. If your election is in August of 2021, but the city has a ballot proposal at the same time to build a new recreation center, that's going to affect turnout. If you've been through some significant controversy within your district, that's going to affect turnout. When I moved to Matamidi as superintendent in 1985, they'd had a very bitter teacher strike shortly before that. So the mood, the climate within the district definitely matters. And also of significant importance is chance of organized opposition. Organized opposition always drives the vote higher. I love this sign for a couple reasons. One, it's a great example of organized opposition. This was someone that was against an operating levy in White Bear Lake. I think they might levy, not being against blue jeans. But when you have organized opposition, you can definitely count on turnout being somewhere around 10% more than what you would have otherwise predicted. So as you look at turnout and the relationship to how many yes voters you needed to win, kind of like a New Prague example, this is a chart that just kind of emphasizes that same concept. The first row left to right is showing you that there's 20,000 registered voters within the district. The estimated turnout ranges from 6,500 to 13,500, depending on, again, is this a November 2020 election or is this a August all by myself election? You can see the needed to win row. You'd need more than twice as many yes votes to win over on that high turnout election. And your parents are always going to be a fixed percentage of registered voters. A lot of school folks are surprised to know that in 90% of the districts that I work with, the parent population ranges from 15 to 25%. So in this particular model, you're seeing it at 5,000 registered voters. That'd be a kind of a typical amount. So obviously, you're not going to get all of those parents to vote, but if you miraculously could get them all to vote, you can see over on the left, in a low turnout election, you're a winner, and over on the right, you're a big loser. So understanding turnout is a very important first step in developing a GOTV plan. So where do we find the needed yes voters, to actually win the election? This graphic represents one of the planning tools that Baker Tilly provides to school districts that we're helping with elections. And this particular tool is called a voter file and target structure. And when we build a voter file and target structure, what comes out at the end of doing this work is an Excel spreadsheet. And in that Excel spreadsheet, we have lots of information. On the left side, you see demographic voter file L2. This is a commercial file that we purchase on behalf of our school client that we're working with. It includes complete voter history of every registered voter living within the boundaries of the school district, but it also includes a lot of other stuff, gender, age, where people live within the district. We look at how many times people have voted in the last 9 elections held within the boundaries of the district. This is not school elections, this is any election. And so everybody's categorized as 9 of 9 or 8 of 9 or 7 of 9 in terms of their past voting frequency. Over on the right side where you have the little bubbles, this is information that we would get from the school district. And then on the bottom, we use a predictive database called VAN. And with VAN, every registered voter within the boundaries of the district has a number from 1 to 100. And the higher your number, the more likely you're going to vote yes in the referendum. My VAN number is 91, and I live in St. Paul. So if St. Paul runs a referendum, they should be grabbing me and pulling me into the voting booth because they're very likely they're going to get a yes vote. So all those databases that you see around that graphic are all merged into one common database. And from that common database, we build the voter file and target structure. I mentioned the L2. This is some of the demographic information that's inside of that L2 file that we buy. I mentioned a voter activation network. Sometimes we use PRISM. In PRISM, every registered voter living within the boundaries of the school district is put into one of 66 clusters. Clusters are, for example, a cluster might be old, white, college-educated men. Might be a cluster, might be one of those 66 clusters. So with using that tool, you would see what kinds of demographic clusters do we have within the district. And if you did a scientific random sample survey as part of your planning, you could identify that clusters 2, 9, 16, 32, and 44 were the most supportive, for example. And in that voter file target structure, you can drill down name, address, and phone number to all of that. The VAN I mentioned, with that VAN score of 1 to 100, the higher the number, the more likely you're going to vote yes. So our voter file and target structure, we're starting with all registered voters. So as you look at this graphic, think of all the registered voters within your district in this picture. Then what we're doing is trying to figure out of all those voters, which ones are likely to vote yes, and which ones do we need to grab by the arm and pull them into the voting booth. The process that we do to do that now is very much technology and database driven, but the strategy is as old as time. Peel and Hall, in a seminal book about referenda, talked about the same thing 60 years ago. And back in those days, they used 3x5 index cards. And Peel and Hall identified demographic characteristics associated with yes votes. I'm going to give you some examples. And I'll just tell you the question, and then I'll wait a second and tell you the answer, and you can see how you did. According to Peel and Hall, 60 years ago, who's more likely to vote yes on your referendum, a woman or a man? The answer is a woman. Young person or old person? The answer is young person. Married person or single? The answer is married. Parent or non-parent? The answer is parent. Education level, higher education or high school education? Higher education. Low to moderate income or moderate to high income? Moderate to high income. Democrat or Republican? Democrat. White or African American? African American. Now, if this were to be done today, of course, when you get down to the racial characteristics, you'd be talking about more than white and African American. But again, this was 60 years ago. So 60 years ago, they were looking at demographic characteristics like this to figure out, out of this big room of people, who do you want to get in the door with your get out the vote effort to try to win that election? The combination of that voter file that I talked about, counting your voters, doing a scientific random sample feasibility survey, all moves you to identify that target structure. Sticking again with this theme of the auditorium representing all registered voters living within your district, we're beginning to identify specific people and demographic groups. You see the arrow pointing at a renter. Renters typically are anywhere from 5 to 10% more supportive than non-renters. Well, the L2 file that I mentioned includes information about people based on whether they rent or they own. So you're able to pull that information from L2 to see how many renters you have. If you did a scientific random sample survey, you might find out that the voters in Ward 3 were much more supportive than the other wards. Again, you can drill down, pull a file, name, address, phone number of registered voters who live in Ward 3. And the rest of these are similar examples. Over on the right, you've got people with relatively higher VAN scores, females, etc. So we're going through our registered voter file. We're developing targets based on demographic characteristics, likelihood to vote yes.
Then he looked into my eyes. Lord knows to my surprise, the only one who could ever reach me was the son of a preacher man. The only boy who could ever teach me was the son of a preacher man.
I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember that song, but it's a great example of this targeting concept. In this particular case, Dusty Springfield was looking for the son of the preacher man, and she was looking for him in particular based on his age, politics, parent status, and other factors identified in the voter file. And if all of those characteristics identified him as a yes voter, and then we looked into L2 and found out that he had voted in 7 out of the last 9 elections. There's a little star above his head. And when we get to the phase of the campaign of getting out to vote, we're going to be after that son of the preacher man. So groups typically in your GOTV audience, Just for some general ideas, identified supporters based on a survey. We oftentimes do feasibility surveys 4 to typically 7 months before a referendum. And in that survey, when we go into the analytics, we can say we had the strongest support from women as compared to men. We can look at support levels based on age, based on ward or precinct, based on past voting frequency, and a half a dozen other characteristics. So by analyzing that data, you can identify which demographic groups are more supportive. High Democratic performance precincts are always going to be a winner. I talked about the van indication. We're able to identify, for instance, which voters in your district had van scores of 80 or higher, for example. The past supporter lists relates to if you ran a referendum in, let's say, 2018, and now you're going to do another one in 2021. If you have an Excel file of who was identified as a yes voter back in 2018, we can merge that file in when we build the voter file and target structure. People who always vote, if we look at your registered voter database, and let's say we sort out everybody who's voted in at least 7 out of the last 9 elections, you can pretty much count on the fact that they're going to vote. So if they're going to vote, you better interact with them, engage with them, and try to educate and persuade. This is a graphic of what that voter file target structure looks like when it's all done. I mentioned that when we prepare one for a school district, it's at the end product is an Excel database. And what we're looking for in that target structure are 2 characteristics of the voters. One, how supportive are they of your referendum proposal? And you can see the dark green is strong support. We also want to know how likely are they to get in the door and cast a ballot. We could have 500 people who are ardent supporters of your referendum, but they might have a combined history of voting 2 out of the last 9 elections. So are they likely to vote? Very likely to vote. Where you see the term push voter, those are voters that get there about half the time. So to get them across the doorway, you got to push. And so the voter file and target structure, that Excel database I talked about, looks at both likelihood to vote yes and likelihood to vote at all. And based on those characteristics, builds the target structure. This is what that target structure might look like at the end of the day when you're getting ready to actually start your get out the vote plan and execution for your campaign. So when you see the targets in the boldface and the first column, this represents that target A is your best target. You've got 1,250 people in target A. So what would make them best? Based on what I've already talked about, it's 2 things. How likely are they to vote yes? Based on their demographic characteristics, based on their VAN score, based on the survey results, how likely are they to vote yes? And the second characteristic is how likely are they to get in the door? A voter who's only gotten there 1 out of the last 9 isn't very likely to get in the door as compared to someone who's voted in 7 out of the last 9. So target A is your best target. You don't have to understand the VLP stuff. That's just indicating what their characteristics are. The key takeaway is target A is your best target. Target B is your second best target. Target C is your third best target. And so when you start working through the get out the vote plan, you're going to start with target A. As you can see, we estimated we could get 700 votes, 700 yes votes out of target A. Well, once your get out the vote volunteers are all finished with target A, then you compare how many yes votes do you think you have as compared to what your estimate was at the front end. In this particular case, you can see it's saying winning at 3,300. This particular example was a district with roughly 5,100 registered voters. Once we knew there were 5,100 registered voters, you need half of that to win. And then we multiplied it times 1.3, which you would have seen earlier in the presentation. We multiply it times 1.3 to provide some margin. So if something goes wrong, you still have a chance to be successful. So in this particular case, the GOTV plan had a goal of getting 3,300 yes voters. And based on the expected turnout for the election, if they can accomplish that, that should result in a winning referendum. So we've got all this data, we've got our targets, then what do we do? When you get into some of the research on GOTV and what works and how people get in the door, there's something called a predictive voting rational choice theory. Sounds very kind of highfalutin, technical, but as we break it down, it also is very much common sense. So let's walk through that formula and see how that's relevant to getting out the vote. P stands for power of one vote. You've all heard that in some context. Every vote matters. Your vote is extremely important. The B is the benefit to kids for voting yes. D relates to your civic duty as a citizen and a parent of the district. And C is the cost to your taxes. And so if you remember your math formulas, what it's showing here is everything to the left needs to be more persuasive than the cost. So let's walk through here and give some examples. So P, as we mentioned, was the power of every vote. We are expecting a very close election, and your vote is critically important. An example of a message that reinforces the power of each vote.
Both of you seem to have good enough messages for exactly 246 votes. We'll see on Monday who draws the letter Z, and it sounds like there'll probably be a recount as well. But Frank Moe and Christian Wharton, thank you for your time, and I guess good luck.
This was from Eastern Cook County in Minnesota, which is up north. In an election in November of 2018, two county commissioners tied. Both received 246 votes. One of them ended up joining the county commissioners based on a game of Scrabble, believe it or not. So when you have a tie vote like that, sometimes the outcome is based on chance, drawing cards, or in their case, Scrabble. One of my colleagues at Baker Tilly is Kelly Smith, who some of you know, I know. In his prior life, he was also a superintendent, and in 2004 had the unhappy outcome of losing a bond referendum on a vote of 868 to 868. With school referenda, a tie vote is a loss. And so that was a very disappointing outcome in Belle Plaine, and reinforces in a very real way the importance and the power of every single vote. So the second part of that formula was benefit. What is the expected benefit of voting yes? Passage is crucial to the educational future of our kids and our grandkids. And of course, in your literature and in your message, you go more deeply into that to explain why it's crucial. But that's the key message, that the benefit is worth the cost. The C is that civic duty. We all have a responsibility as community members to do our part to support our kids. Sometimes you'll hear messages like, our kids aren't going to get a second chance. This is it. So there is a sense of duty. That's the D in the formula. And the cost, the investment in our kids and community will cost only pennies a day. Of course, by the time you get to the campaign, we're not talking about $252 of increased property taxes. We're talking about one latte a week, or breaking it down in this particular case to just pennies a day. So again, looking at that formula, the power of one vote, the benefit to kids, our civic duty, we need that to be more than what the cost is in terms of tax impact. So as we get to GOTV, find yes votes by making a strong case that the importance of each vote, the benefit to kids, and civic duty is greater than the cost. Or a statement something like this: as parents and members of this community, we need to make this happen for our kids. Now is the time to invest in our schools and children. The cost is modest, and our kids don't get a second chance. Every vote is vital to our success, and we thank you for your support. And as I went through that formula, I think you can read and hear that message and see all parts of that formula in that messaging. Speaking of acknowledging past voting, I'm not necessarily recommending this to school folks, but I thought you'd just be curious to know it does happen. In this particular case, this is a voting violation that some was put in someone's mailbox, and it's the top person, Braddock Massey, is the person that lives at that address, and the names below are all his neighbors. And so in this particular case, the campaign is putting it in your face, if you will, and trying to almost shame people to get in the door. Again, I'm not saying it's a good strategy. The example is more provided to you as for interest to see to what extent campaigns emphasize turnout when it gets to GOTV. I'm going to take a 5-6 minute break right now to give you a chance to stretch your legs or get another cup of coffee or whatever. My clock says 10:11, and I'll plan to start up again at 10:18. Thank you. Dave, are you hearing my voice okay?
Yep.
Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. Before I move on, just to review what we've done so far and just kind of highlight a couple things. In planning for getting out the vote, the first two things we emphasized were, first of all, to know your demographics of your registered voters. How many do you have? What are their characteristics? Also, it's important to identify among all those registered voters, similar to the graphic of all the people in the auditorium, which ones are more likely to vote yes, based on a scientific random sample survey, based on their VAN score, their demographic characteristics. How many are there of those people? Build your target structure. Then we talked about the importance of estimating turnout. Using that New Prague example, they won with a number of about 1,500 yes votes, and they lost with 600 more yes votes. So turnout is important in terms of estimating that. You set your target of how many yes votes to get in the door. So a good GOTV campaign knows that we need to find 3,300 yes votes and get them in the door. So you set your target, so those are the things we've covered so far. The second half of the presentation is going to look a little bit more at research and best practices. If our goal is to get our voters in the door to cast a ballot, what works better than other things? What strategies should we use to optimize that? The main researchers in this area are Donald Green and Alan Gerber. They've written multiple books on research and best practices related to getting out the vote. In all of their experiments, basically what they do is controlled experiments. So for instance, let's say in a particular election, 5,000 people were identified as yes voters. And so they take those 5,000 people and on a random basis, half of them get an email and a phone call. And the other half on a random basis get an email, a phone call, and a knock on the door. After the election's over, they go back and look at the ballots and say, oh, that was interesting. There was no difference between the ones that got an email and a phone call and the ones that got an email, phone call, and knock on the door. Or maybe they look at the data and say, gosh, there was 12% better turnout for those that had the knock on the door. So those are the kind of experiments that they do. And on the last bullet on this page, what they're trying to do is to figure out what GOTV efforts are most effective and most cost effective for the campaign. I just had a frozen screen, sorry about that. This slide just gives you an introduction to kind of the kind of research that they do. What you're seeing in each of these is, and I'll use the door-to-door contacts over on the upper left as an example. What they're saying, according to their research, that if you pound on 16 doors and contact somebody at their door, you get one vote in the ballot box for each 16 knocks on the door. One vote for each 16 knocks on the door. Now, that might not seem very good. Gosh, I knocked on 16 doors, I'm only going to get one vote. But if you compare it to the others, it takes 36 phone calls to get one more vote in the door. It takes 189 leaflets to get one more vote in the door. And so they refer to the face-to-face, door-to-door as the gold standard. So we'll go into some of those in a little bit more detail. So door-to-door canvassing, again, they refer to that as the gold standard because it works the best and nothing else works better.
Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump and his running mate Mike Pence are holding a campaign event in Eau Claire, Wisconsin tomorrow evening, the same day that Democratic vice presidential candidate Tim Kaine visits Appleton and Madison. Candidate rallies like those are just one way to inspire people to get to the polls and vote. Another technique? A knock on your door. If there's a competitive race for Congress or the legislature where you live, canvassers will probably be on your block in this final full week of campaigning. Candidates, the political parties, and interest groups are in full get out the vote mode. But with early voting already a month old and a tumultuous presidential race affecting voter mood, the exercise has evolved. Reporter Brian Baxt has our story.
On a sunny but crisp recent Saturday afternoon, a couple dozen DFL party volunteers gathered in a former bank building for a tutorial. They were about to fan out in a competitive section of the southern Twin Cities suburbs. Their mission was to work down a carefully honed list of probable Democratic voters, to measure their support for the party ticket, and provide one of multiple nudges those voters will get ahead of Election Day. Party activists Eric Anderson and Ryan Sancardier demonstrated to the rookies how it's done.
Have you thought at all about when you're going to go vote?
I don't know. It's like November, right?
Sure, but a lot of your neighbors are early voting.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Back near the old bank vault, volunteer Norm Draper was making his way through a phone call sheet, getting more voicemail than live answers.
Good. Say, the reason I called is we've identified you as a probable DFL supporter this November, and we're wondering if we could ask you a few questions.
This is crunch time, and the all-out effort to reach and motivate voters is intensifying as Election Day approaches. The parties, candidates, and their allies have it down to a science.
So that's an example of that door-to-door contact and the effectiveness of that. It's hard to do. It takes a lot of effort, but it is the most effective way to get out the vote. There's another short video, audio clip you'll hear in a minute about personal and authentic contacts. What that means is if I knock on your door, you open the door and say, "How are you?" That's going to be a much more effective contact than opening the door and looking at a stranger. Door-to-door has indirect benefit. As soon as you're done talking to whomever is at the door, she or he is going to be talking to other people who live in the household about that experience. And so that can be very, very helpful as well. As I mentioned, it's time and labor intensive. Targeted knocks are more effective than blanket. Blanket means we're knocking on every door in the school district. Targeted means, if you go back to that graphic of the auditorium, we're knocking on doors of people in Ward 3, where there are female voters, where there are people with high van scores. That would be a targeted door knock. Many of our school clients use a GIS mapping system to support that door-to-door work. One example of that is the Guide K-12 Forecast 5 product. So if this was up on the whiteboard in your planning room, you're basically populating the map with your target structure. So if you look at the bottom left of the graphic, it says voters with estimated partisan score, that's the van score, over 50. Parents who are frequent voters. So your various targets that you've identified are color-coded on the map. And if it was alive rather than a PowerPoint, you could move your cursor on any of those dots and find out the name, address, and phone number of who that person is as well. So that's an example of a GIS application for door-to-door work. Phoning is also one of the most common ways to work your GOTV. It's not as effective as door-to-door, but almost. Again, one additional vote in the ballot box for each 36 phone calls. Think back to the example of my colleague Kelly Smith in Belle Plaine. Would it have been worthwhile to make 36 more calls to get one more vote? And again, this is emphasizing the authentic connection.
And again, the way that both campaigns understand is the most effective way to persuade those voters in the middle is to reach out to them through their friends and their colleagues and their neighbors.
And that's how the tactics are changing, to try to be particularly influential for those few people who remain undecided. Is that right?
Well, that's right. I think if you back up take half a step back and ask the question, who do people trust? Do people trust politicians? Not so much. Do people trust the news media? No offense, but not especially.
Right.
Do people trust advertising? Certainly not. They trust each other. They trust their friends. They trust their neighbors. They trust their coworkers.
So again, emphasizing the importance of that authentic connection. If I call you and you know me, if I'm your neighbor, we both have kids in the same second grade classroom, if we work together, that's going to be a more effective call than a stranger call. Some school campaigns will hire a professional call center to make all their calls for them. That's better than doing nothing. But for local school elections, the success rate with volunteers is almost 3 times better than the success rate with that professional phone bank. The reminder calls, the closer they are to election day, the better. And as an example, if I get a call on Monday to remind me of a haircut I have on Thursday, that is not nearly as effective as if I get a call on Thursday morning to remind me about a haircut I have Thursday afternoon. Training is important. You don't want to, either for door knocking or for phoning, just turn volunteers loose. They should have a script. They should be trained. They should have resources to help them. Collecting cell phone numbers is very important because it allows for text messaging as well. So let's say you're doing your phoning earlier in the campaign and you find someone that is an ardent supporter of the referendum. If you can get their cell phone number, that allows you on election day to send them a text to remind them to vote. And in terms of using a school district's auto dialer or recorded robocalls, talk to your lawyer to make sure that you're not violating any policies or statutes. Leafleting, unlike door-to-door contact, is when you are dropping something at the front door. Not in the mailbox, but inside the screen, or dropping literature for the campaign. It's important to make sure you pay attention to the 4 C's: clear, concise, compelling, and consistent. And I'll show you an example in a minute of not doing that particularly well. That 1 to 189 again means if I drop off 189 leaflets, I'm going to get one more vote in the ballot box. Good leaflets, rather than going into pages of detail, will give the kind of 40,000-foot key themes, and then URL links to more detail. It's obviously faster than door-to-door because you're not having the conversation. One technique oftentimes used by campaigns is a door hanger. A door hanger has information on it, but it has a little hole that you slip over the handle of the screen door, the front door to the house. The reason those work a little bit better is whoever lives there has to touch it once. And if it's in her or his hand, there's a chance they're going to look at it and read something. There's an example of a leaflet, and they're showing, in this case, where on the ballot the school proposal actually is, so they can identify it when they get into the voting booth. Here's that door hanging example I mentioned with the link to more information. Here it's also a spot to show where your polling place is, if your district is large enough that you've got multiple polling places. Another strategy used in GOTV is direct mail. So these are things that are mailed to the household rather than a leaflet that's dropped off. One more vote in the voting or in the ballot box for every 282 pieces you mail out. This is an opportunity to differentiate your message to a target audience. So if you've done a good job identifying your targets, you know which voter is the son of the preacher man, and you know his age and his marital status, you can target a message to him that would be different than the message I would receive as a grandfather, for example. They also have a secondary benefit of influencing other people that are in the household who might see that piece that is mailed, and a good alternative for campaigns that don't have enough horsepower to do that door-to-door work. Again, both with the direct mail and the leaflets, clear, concise, compelling, and consistent. And here's the negative example I promised of something that does not meet the clear and consistent message. I can assure you that the commitment to excellence will, by its very nature, promote continued transitions into the immediate future. I'm sure if you were not muted, I would hear chuckles and groans. This is a real statement on a real school district brochure that was sent out to people to encourage them to raise their taxes, and definitely did not meet the clear, concise, compelling, and consistent standard. Here's an example of what a mailing might look like. Again, you see there's a spot for a polling place, 4 key messages over on the left, links to more detail. So step 3 is to campaign with that canvassing target structure. I talked before about that target structure of A through F. Canvassing typically done 30 to 60 days before the election. I'm going to start with target A, then go to target B. Canvassing is increasingly multimodal. I mentioned Hustle. That's a campaign app that was used in Spring Lake Park in their last referendum. Increasingly, school districts will have campaign websites. And I'm not talking about the school district, I'm talking about the Yes for Kids website and door-to-door engagement events. We talked about once you know how many yes votes you need, multiply it times 30% to give yourself a little margin. Email, of course, is used frequently in campaigns. Unfortunately, it has a very low efficiency, no detectable effect, in the words of the researchers. There are some things that you can do to make email work a little better. Paying attention to your subject line, and I'll comment on that a little bit more in a minute. Click-through rates on emails range from 26 to 62%. What that means is, you sent someone an email, did they open it and look at it? That's the click-through rate. Short bullet points with more links to detail are better than long-winded messages in email. The next bullet, you're hearing authentic for the 3rd time. If I get an email from somebody I know, that's going to be more effective than if it comes from a stranger. Graphics can help. Viral email, I'll give you an example of that in a minute from a very interesting campaign. There's some words that they suggest you avoid, some characters, and subject lines do matter. Most of us are so busy that when we send an email, we don't spend more than 1 second thinking about, what the subject line is going to be. But with campaigns, it matters. This particular graphic comes from an email that I received to my email account, and the subject of the email was "Your flight confirmed." Well, like a lot of you, I had flights that had been canceled because of COVID that are kind of in the bank. So I'm looking at my emails and I see "Your flight confirmed." I went right to that and opened it. Now, as it turned out, it had nothing to do with my flight, but I clicked and I opened the message. And if you click and open it, there's a chance you're going to read it and be affected by it. So that's an example of the strategy of being a little more thoughtful about your emails. Texting is much more effective than emails for getting out the vote. Nearly 100% open rate for texts. Open means I feel the buzz in my pocket, I pick up my phone, open my text. Much higher open rates for text than for email. They have to be shorter, more focused, of course. One researcher refers to using texting for get out the vote as like cutting to the front of the line. And most of my friends and associates don't get a buzz or any other kind of message when they get an email, but almost all of them get some kind of a buzz or a ding when they get a text. So certainly you can understand why texting would be more effective. Social media is here whether we like it or not, and good campaigns use social media when it comes to getting out the vote. Facebook, 68% of the American population averages 58 minutes per day on Facebook. And so using social media effectively is not something that should be exclusively your get out the vote campaign, but certainly as part of any good campaign. Here's an example of using both a viral email and social media. This is from the Alexandria Public Schools a number of years ago, a project that I worked on for their new high school. And so they started with a viral email. A viral email is when you get 20 volunteers together, you design a message and a subject line for that email, and you ask all of them to send them to their contact list of people who live within the district that they have in their contacts, their friends, their neighbors, their relatives, their coworkers, and the message goes out to their contacts, and the last thing on the message says, please forward this to people in your contact list. So viral email, much like a COVID viral, starts off with 20, and within 24 hours, it might have been sent out to, 1,000 people. And in many cases, people get multiple emails because they're in different contact lists as well. So that's viral email. In this particular example with Alexandria, they had this graphic that went out with their viral email. And the message in the email said, go to your Facebook page or other social media where you have a photograph of yourself and replace your photograph with this graphic. So those of you that use social media know that if I go into Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever, and I take my picture and I put this graphic in as my new picture, that it automatically goes out to everybody as kind of an update. And so this was a way that they engaged with lots of people using viral email and social media, I think the day before the election. Festivals, rallies, they can increase turnout anywhere from 0.1 to 3.8%. It's getting everybody into the gym for the band playing and the pumping people up. The day before, we're going to go out and do our door knocking. These can be effective. They can get people excited, and they can create energy for the final push in terms of getting people out the door. The reference to quid pro quo means be a little bit careful you don't do anything that would appear to be trying to buy a vote. This would be an example of a rally. And here's another one.
That's why we're on this tour, to convince the non-voters and the slackers to come out and vote. Who amongst you didn't vote in the 2000 election? Can I see your hands if you did not vote? Don't be afraid, nothing's gonna happen to you. If you did not vote, stand up if you would please. Stand up, back there, stand up over there. Stand up over here, anybody? If you did not vote in the 2000 election, 22 or over, I'd like you to pledge in front of all these thousands of people tonight. And if you will do this, my slacker friends, I will give you a full day's supply of the sustenance of slackers everywhere, ramen noodles. Or for you slacker guys, a clean change of underwear. Will you pledge to vote this year? Will you vote? Will you vote? Will you vote?
Now, before I leave that, that's a rather long video clip, but independent from your politics, if you can imagine having 1,500 people in your auditorium and firing them up in that way the day before the election, you will increase turnout. There's no question about it, and increase the excitement and energy in those last efforts with the campaign. So a good GOTV plan has to be written down. And a lot of times we say, is it most important that it really be good or that you really reach lots of people? And the answer is you got to do both. It needs to be high quality and high volume. Budget for the cost, what you're going to do. If you're going to call with volunteers, the cost is zero. If you're going to call with a call center, it's not zero. Recruit and train your volunteers. Again, pay attention to the law. Use your target structure. Your first calls, your first door knocks should be to target A, then move to target B. Plan for multiple GOTV strategies. Differentiate your strategies based on past voting history, and implement early voting strategies to maximize turnout. One of the challenges with this is young parents in that 18 to 40-year-old range typically turn out at about 10 to 15% in low turnout elections. So what are you going to do to change that in terms of differentiated strategies? Maybe you organize your GOTV at the classroom level with 2 volunteers from every single classroom in the district organizing to get out the vote. It's also increasingly important to pay attention to early voting. In 2016, North Branch had an unsuccessful bond referendum, and they had 122 early votes. 1 year later, they had a successful bond referendum and had 759 early votes. And those early votes were recruited by the campaign. So what's your budget? How much money do you need? How many volunteers do you need? what organizations can help. In a November 2020, you might have door knockers who are door knocking for the Democratic Party willing to also hand out material from the school district, for instance. What phones are you going to use? Cell phones? You're going to rent some phones? Do you need cars to give people rides on election day or to babysit the kids so they can go vote? Do you need a place that's a staging area, a place that coordinates to get out the vote? I mentioned earlier the importance of differentiating strategies, and I'll just touch base on this chart briefly. This is again looking at the last 9 elections. So the idea on this particular chart is once you've identified your 3,400 voters you're going to go for on election day, for those who pretty much always vote, maybe a phone call is all they need. That's the 6 out of 9. For those that get there 2 out of 9 times, you can see over on the right, they're going to get 3 phone calls, 2 emails, a leaflet, a text, and a door-to-door contact. The researchers Gerber and Green said the folks on the bottom category need 9 to 11 contacts. Well, from that voter file and target structure that we built earlier, that gives you the ability to segregate your identified yes voters into these groups. Name, address, and phone number of the first group. Name, address, and phone number of the second group. So by doing so, the campaign can differentiate the interventions that are done to get them in the door. This is just an example of looking at a successful election, and I won't go through the whole thing because it's complex. I'll just take the first 2. If you look at the left bar, the top light green right at the very top, that shows the percentage of people who were in their target A group, their best group. And then to the right, it shows how many of those people they got in the door to vote. So again, the left is what proportion those top tier A group was compared to all voters, pretty small proportion. But in terms of the proportion of how many votes were in the ballot box, they got a lot of them in the door, greater than their natural proportion. And so this is just showing how well the district did with their various targets. And the key takeaway is you need to get more people in the door to vote than naturally would be their proportion. And that's the whole point of getting out the vote. I'm going to pass over this summary and recommendations, so I make sure we've got a few minutes at the end for questions, but you'll get a copy of the PDF so you can review those if you want. And I'm going to finish with just a part of a video clip, and then we'll go to some questions. I said at the beginning that one of the problems with school referenda is it's pretty common for campaigns to run out of gas before they get to the finish line. And if any of you were in track when you were growing up, most good track coaches told you to accelerate through the finish line rather than to kind of stumble to the finish line. And a good GOTV effort does that. When you get the PDF, there are some references and resources that you can grab a hold of, including some phone and door knocking scripts, for example. And I'll just do part of this clip and then we'll save a few minutes for questions.
오빤 강남 스타일 강남 스타일 낮에는 따사로운 인간적인 여자 커피 한 잔에 여유를 아는 품격 있는 여자 밤이 오면 심장이 뜨거워지는 여자 그런 반전 있는 여자 너는 선호해 낮에는 너만큼 따사로운 그런 선호해 커피 식기도 전에 원샷 때리는 선호해 밤이 오면 심장이 터져버리는 선호해 그런 선호해 아름다워 사랑스러워 Oppan Gangnam Style.
So I hope you enjoy that. And I hope it emphasizes the importance of planning and delivering on a strategic, get out the vote plan with energy and excitement and drive. So I'll stop there, and it looks like we've got about 7 or 8 minutes for questions. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you have one.
Don, I see that this presentation is just a little bit different than your book. I learned some new stuff here today, so but I have read your book as well. So thank you for the presentation. And we had a failed election last year with 5,000 votes, which is the exact number that our last one passed by. So because of the high voter turnout, we just weren't able to overcome that type of ratio, but we did have 5,000 yes votes. So those are the ones that, I definitely hope come out back again this coming fall.
Thank you, Eric. The book that you have is the second edition. The purpose of this is not to sell books, but just to make you aware that I did author a third edition with Barbara Nickel. So there's a new chapter on communications in that particular book as well. Other questions? Going once, going twice. Well, again, you will be, as I understand it, getting a copy of the PDF. So if there are follow-up questions or you need to contact someone to get some help or advice, that information will be there for you. And again, my thanks to MASA for giving me the opportunity to participate in the master's class.